Take a moment to consider this. Everything in your life, the joys and the sorrows, the triumphs and the failures, fits into a divine purpose. It may not always seem obvious, especially in difficult moments when nothing makes sense. Throughout my journey, I have met countless people who wrestle with the uncertainty of life, trying to understand why certain events unfold the way they do. Hardships often feel overwhelming, and the path forward appears unclear, yet nothing happens by chance. Every experience, whether joyful or painful, is part of a greater plan beyond our immediate understanding. I've spent my life sharing the message that God has a plan greater than anything we can comprehend. That's not my opinion. It's the truth of Scripture. God has something important to tell you today, and I don't say that lightly. Everything happens for a reason. Everything has a divine purpose. I want you to let that sink in. So many were carrying burdens, searching for answers. Maybe that's you today. But let me tell you, every struggle, every closed door, every painful moment is part of something greater than we can see right now. There were times in my own life when I didn't understand why God allowed certain things to happen. But looking back, I see His hand guiding me every step of the way. What if you could see your life through God's eyes? Imagine understanding that what hurts you today is actually preparing you for something incredible tomorrow. Are you ready to see God's master plan for your life? To trust that nothing you've been through is a mistake? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will not only give you hope, it will bring you a peace beyond understanding. Before we move forward, I want you to do something important. Write in the comments, God, in you I trust. By doing this, you are proclaiming that you trust in God's plan for your life, even when you don't have all the answers. My dear friend, I invite you to stay with us until the end of this message. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so that YouTube will alert you when we share more messages of hope. Now let's begin. Number 1, Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. We all make plans, don't we? We set goals. We dream of success. We chart our own course. And there's nothing wrong with that. I've met young men and women filled with ambition, eager to accomplish great things. But what Proverbs 19:21 reminds us is this: no matter how many plans we make, it is ultimately God's purpose that prevails. I think of the countless times I've sat with people who have shared how their plans fell apart. Business ventures that failed, relationships that ended, careers that crumbled. Maybe you've experienced something similar. You thought you had everything figured out, and then suddenly, life took an unexpected turn. It's easy to feel lost when that happens. We live in a world that tells us we're in control, that if we just work hard enough, plan well enough, we can shape our lives exactly how we want. But my friends, the truth is that we only see a small part of the picture. While we focus on the present moment, God sees it all, past, present, and future, woven together in a grand design that we can't yet comprehend. Have you ever made plans that seem solid, only to watch them fall apart? You're not alone. I've been there, and I've seen so many others walk through the same valley. But here's the question I want to ask you. What if those unexpected detours, those disappointments, are not failures at all? What if they are signs that God is redirecting your path to something far better? This is where faith comes in. When our plans don't work out the way we expect, it's easy to grow discouraged. But let me assure you, God's purpose is always greater than anything we could imagine. Even when we don't understand, even when it hurts, even when it seems like life is in chaos, God is working for our good. If we trust in His guidance, we will find that even when we're not where we planned to be, we are exactly where we need to be. I know it's not easy to let go of control. We all want to feel secure, to know that we have a handle on our lives. But true freedom comes when we surrender to God's purpose, when we stop trying to do things our way and allow Him to lead us. That doesn't mean we shouldn't dream or make plans. It means we must be willing to lay those plans at the feet of the Lord and say, Lord, your will be done. One of the greatest lessons we can learn is humility. Too often, our plans are motivated by pride rather than a true desire to follow God's will. And that's where we need to pause and ask ourselves, am I chasing my own dreams or am I pursuing the dreams God has for me? It's a delicate balance, but when we submit our desires to God, we find that His ways are always higher than our ways. His plans are always better than ours. So, my friends, as you reflect on your life today, I want to encourage you, trust in the Lord. No matter where you are, no matter what you're facing, remember this, God's purpose will always prevail. Will you trust Him? God never improvises. His purpose is immutable. Over the years, I have seen lives transformed. People who came to the feet of Christ in the midst of hopelessness. And I have learned something fundamental. God never changes with circumstances or with our failures. I remember preaching at a crusade and seeing a broken man convinced that he had ruined his life beyond restoration. But what he didn't know was that God already knew the end of his story. Every detail of his life was woven with purpose, even those moments of anguish. That's the truth that gives us peace in times of uncertainty. Our plan may falter, but God's won't. So when your plans fail, when things don't go the way you hoped, remember this, God is still in control. His purpose prevails. Even though you can't see it right now, you can trust that He is working in every detail, leading you toward the future that is better than you could have ever imagined. Number 2, Isaiah 46:10 says, I declare the end from the beginning, from ancient times, things that have not yet come to pass. I say, my purpose will be fulfilled, and I will do all my pleasure. Young people who don't know which path to take, parents worried about their children's future, elderly people wondering if their life has had meaning. But here's something I want you to remember. God doesn't just know the future, He declares it. Before it happens, He has already seen it. That changes our perspective completely, doesn't it? We only see fragments of the present. We fret over what's next, what we can't control. But God sees the whole story at a glance. From beginning to end, everything is under His perfect knowledge. There are no surprises for God. There are no unexpected events. Every event in your life, every unexpected turn is within His plan. Today you may feel like things are out of control, but I want you to know that everything is clear to God. I remember a man who came to me after a message in New York. He had lost everything, his business, his marriage, his hope. He looked at me and said, Billy, I feel like my life is over. But it wasn't. God still had a purpose for him. And the same is true for you. God doesn't just know the future, He controls it. His sovereignty is absolute. There is nothing in the universe that is outside His will. Sometimes when things don't go the way we expect, we think God has lost control. But let me tell you something, that never happens. His plan is still firm. There is no power on earth or in heaven that can thwart it. And that is the greatest source of peace we can have. God's plan doesn't change. He set it in place from the beginning, and nothing that happens in this world can alter it. That means no matter what you face today, God's purpose will be fulfilled. You may not always understand it. The path may seem dark, but His will is irresistible. What He has chosen to do, He will do. When you understand this, there is a deep rest you can experience. Even in the midst of uncertainty, you can trust that God is at work. I know there are times when everything seems confusing, but God isn't confused. What seems uncertain or out of control to you is perfectly planned out for Him. And here's a beautiful thing, assurance. You can trust that God's purpose for your life will be fulfilled. Nothing can stop it. Hardships, obstacles, doubts, none of those things can stop God from doing what He's promised. And that plan is good. Even when it doesn't seem like it, even when the road is difficult, God has a perfect purpose for you. I've seen it time and time again. People who thought all was lost discovered that God had something much bigger in store for them. And the same is true for you. That's why there's hope in God's plan. He already knows your future. He's planned it and declared it from the beginning. And even though you may not see how things will work out right now, you can be assured that God is at work. His promises will be fulfilled no matter what you face today. And that's the hope that keeps us going. No matter how uncertain your present is, the future is secured in the hands of a sovereign God who sees the end from the beginning. Number 3, Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." Have you ever wondered if your life has a clear purpose? If the difficulties you go through make any sense? Or if it's all just chaos and chance? There's a promise in Jeremiah 29:11 that reminds us of something crucial. God has a plan for you. It's not just any plan. It's not an empty promise. It's a plan full of well-being, designed specifically to give you a hopeful future. And that changes everything. The first thing we need to remember is that God is in total control. He's not winging it with our lives. Every situation you find yourself in, no matter how complicated it may seem, is under God's absolute control. There are no accidents or coincidences in the life of the believer. Throughout my ministry, I've seen countless examples of this. I remember a story from a woman who wrote to me after one of our crusades. She had lost everything, her husband, her home, her health, and she told me she couldn't understand why God would allow so much suffering. But then, over time, she began to see how God was working even in the midst of her pain. God knows exactly what He's doing, even when we can't see the bigger picture. And His plan is always geared toward good, even when we can't understand it at the time. When we read this passage in the Bible, it's important to consider the context. God spoke these words to the people of Israel when they were exiled in Babylon. Imagine what that meant to them. Far from home, surrounded by a foreign nation, feeling like everything they knew was gone. But in the midst of that darkness, God reminded them that He hadn't forgotten them. He promised them a future filled with hope, even when their circumstances seemed hopeless. And my friend, that same message holds true for you today. In your most desperate moments, when it seems like everything is falling apart, God still has a plan. He has not forgotten you. Now you may be wondering, how does this apply to my life today? Look around you. We all face hardships, trials that seem to make no sense. In my travels around the world, I have spoken to people who have experienced unspeakable tragedies. Parents who have lost their children, people who have been betrayed by those they trusted, men and women who have seen their dreams crumble before their eyes. And yet I have seen how God has used those very trials to bring them to a place of greater faith, of greater trust in Him. Sometimes the greatest blessings come in the most unexpected packages. God is preparing something incredible, and even if you don't see it now, it will come. When the Bible talks about well-being, it is not simply about having a comfortable or trouble-free life. It is not about accumulating wealth or being successful in the eyes of the world. Well-being in the biblical context means living in the fullness of God's purpose. It means having peace in the midst of the storm, finding strength in the most difficult times, growing spiritually through every trial. I have met people with all the money in the world and yet they are empty. But I have also met men and women who have nothing materially but who live with a peace and joy that can only come from God. The trials we face are not meaningless obstacles. They are tools in God's hands to shape us, to prepare us for what is to come. The difficulties you face today may seem insurmountable, but they have a purpose. Every trial has the potential to develop your character, teach you valuable lessons, and prepare you for future blessings. I remember when I was young and faced times when I didn't know which path to take. But every challenge, every moment of uncertainty led me to a deeper faith. Nothing is wasted in God's plan. Every tear, every challenge is building something greater in you. God sees beyond what you can see right now. Sometimes we feel like we're stuck in the dark, unable to understand the purpose behind our suffering. But we can trust that it's all part of a bigger divine plan. What God promises in this verse is not an empty hope, it's a sure reality. His faithfulness is unwavering, and the future He promises you doesn't depend on your achievements or failures, but solely on His love and promise. That future that awaits you is filled with peace, fulfillment, and most importantly, the presence of God. At the end of the day, what matters most is that God is with us. No matter what you're going through, He's walking beside you every step of the way. So in the midst of uncertainty, when you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, remember this: God is in control. He knows every detail of your life. Don't despair. If things don't go the way you planned, your story isn't over yet. And the best part of all is that the author of your story is the same God who promised to give you a future full of hope. Don't give up. Don't lose faith. God is still working. And if you ever doubt this, go back to Scripture. In Romans 8:28, God's word tells us, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This is a promise that has been fulfilled time and time again in the lives of those who trust in God. And let me tell you something I've seen with my own eyes. When we give our lives to Christ, when we trust that He is working even in the hardships, we find a peace that surpasses all understanding. Maybe you're going through a trial right now and you're asking yourself, why me, Lord? I've been there. I know what it's like to cry out to God in the middle of the night, not understanding the purpose of what you're experiencing. But let me assure you of one thing: God doesn't leave anything to chance. You may not see the purpose now. Everything may seem like a mess. But God is weaving something beautiful behind the scenes. There is a perfect plan in play, one that we can't fully see from our limited perspective. It's like we're looking at only part of the canvas when God has already painted the whole picture. So today, I want to invite you to trust Him. No matter what's going on in your life, no matter how dark the road seems, remember, God is in control. And in His perfect timing, you'll see all the pieces fall into place. Don't give up. Keep believing. God continues working. I have seen it time and time again. People yearning for God's plan to unfold in their lives, yet hesitant to fully surrender to Him. But my friends, if we truly want to see God's purpose revealed, we must give ourselves completely into His hands. And yes, that requires absolute trust, a faith that goes beyond our understanding. It is easy to trust God when everything is going well. But what about when life doesn't make sense? That is when real faith takes root. Loving God means following His will even when the road ahead is unclear. After all, who knows better than our Heavenly Father what we truly need? There are moments when it feels as though God is silent in the midst of our struggles. But let me assure you, Just because you do not hear Him does not mean He is not at work. God never abandons His children. Even when your world seems to be falling apart, He is there, shaping you, preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine. You may not see it now, but every step, every tear, every prayer that feels unanswered is forging something powerful within you. I remember a time in my own life when I faced trials that tested my faith. I cried out to the Lord, wondering why He seemed so distant. But through those moments, I learned something invaluable. God's silence does not mean His absence. He's always working, often in ways we cannot comprehend. Every hardship is a tool He uses to draw us closer to Him, to teach us to depend entirely on His strength. And here's something many misunderstand. When Scripture tells us that God works for our good, it does not mean He promises us material wealth or earthly success. His definition of good goes much deeper. God's plan is about shaping our hearts, refining our character, making us more like Christ. Have you ever considered that the very challenges, disappointments, and losses you face may be God's way of molding you into the image of His Son? It is not an easy truth to accept, I know that. But every hardship, every blow that life delivers is sculpting you, bringing you closer to the spiritual maturity God desires for you. And do not think for a moment that this is some generic promise meant for others. No, my friend, God has a unique calling for you, a divine purpose that only you can fulfill. You are not an exception. The ultimate well-being God promises is directly connected to this purpose. And even when we do not understand the road we are on, we must trust that He is guiding us toward His perfect plan. Holding on to faith in the face of uncertainty is one of the hardest things we will ever do. But it is precisely in those moments that our relationship with God grows the strongest. Now let me talk to you about something we all need: patience. So often we expect immediate answers. We want to see results now. But let me remind you, God is never in a hurry, yet He is always on time. You may feel that He is taking too long, but I assure you, He is orchestrating every detail of your life with perfect wisdom. The key is not to lose heart. Keep pressing forward, because what God is building in you is something far more beautiful than you can see right now. God does not make mistakes, and though the journey may feel long, His work in your life will be perfect in the end. So the next time you face a trial, remember this: God is with you every step of the way. He leaves nothing to chance. And even in your darkest moments, your life is filled with purpose. And that brings me to something we must never forget. Psalm 103:19. The Lord has established His throne in heaven, and His kingdom rules over all. Let that sink in. The Lord, the creator of the universe, is seated on His throne, and there is nothing outside of His control. Not one single thing. It is easy to forget this when we look around and see chaos, uncertainty, and even injustice. But my friends, though the world may seem out of order, God is still reigning. He is not like earthly rulers whose decisions are flawed and whose reigns are temporary. No, the rule of God is absolute. He holds everything, nations, governments, and yes, even the intimate concerns of your heart in His hands. There is not a single detail that escapes His notice. And here's the incredible truth: His kingdom is eternal and unshakable. While human empires rise and fall, while leaders change and power shifts, God's reign remains constant. His throne cannot be challenged. No force on earth or in heaven can compete with His authority. Sometimes it may seem as though evil is winning, that injustice is prevailing. But what we fail to see is that God's kingdom stands firm, and His justice will always triumph, although not always in the way or timing we expect. I have seen many seasons in my life, And through them all, I have come to this conclusion: our hope is not in this world. It is not in governments, economies, or human institutions. Our hope is in the eternal reign of our Lord. When everything seems out of control, I remember something I have preached for years: God has never lost control. Throughout my life, I have seen times of crisis, times when humanity seemed to teeter on the edge of the abyss. I have spoken with presidents, world leaders, and millions of people who have shared with me their fears about the future. But one truth remains unchanged: God is still on the throne. He is not surprised by what happens in the world or in your life. The Bible tells us in Hebrews 4:13 that nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Every situation, every detail of our lives is under His supervision. Nothing happens without His permission. That doesn't mean we don't face difficulties. In my travels around the world, I have met persecuted Christians, families torn apart by war, people who have lost everything. But one thing I have learned: we can rest in God's unquestionable authority. No matter how big our problems are, God is still on the throne. When I was young, an old pastor told me, "Billy, never let the noise of the world drown out the voice of God." And it's true. It's easy to lose sight of this truth when we focus only on what we see here on earth. Governments change, systems fall, power seems to be in the hands of a few. But the reality is that true power resides on the heavenly throne. God's kingdom doesn't change with political decisions or historical events. I have seen it throughout time. Dictators have ruled, empires have risen and fallen, but God has never been dethroned. He is still at work behind the scenes, moving the pieces according to His perfect will. We don't always understand how He does it, but we can trust that His plan is greater than our understanding. And here's something to remember with hope: God's justice is perfect. In a world filled with injustice, where sometimes the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer, let's remember that God is the ultimate judge. We may not always see justice right away, but the Bible assures us in Deuteronomy 32:4 that all His works are perfect and all His ways are just. There's no action, no injustice that God overlooks. For those of us who belong to His kingdom, this is a source of great comfort. We do not have to fear what the future holds for us, because we know that God sees everything and acts with absolute justice. When I preached at my crusades, I used to tell the crowd, if you are a citizen of the heavenly kingdom, then you live under the sovereignty of an eternal, loving, and just King. And that truth still holds true today. Our greatest security is not in what we possess or in those who rule over us, but in the fact that our destiny is in the hands of a powerful God. This means that no matter what happens in our lives, we can rest easy, knowing that God is in charge, that He takes care of every detail, and that His throne will never be moved. So if you feel overwhelmed by what's going on in your life or in the world today, I want you to remember this: God is still on the throne. His kingdom rules over all, and you, as part of His kingdom, can rest in His perfect control. Number 6, Psalm 37:5. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt overwhelmed by the weight of making important decisions? I have. I remember when I was young wondering if I should really dedicate my life to preaching. The burden of that decision seemed too heavy. But one day, I read this verse, and I knew what I had to do. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. This isn't just good advice. It's an invitation to stop carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders and allow God to take control. Committing our way to God isn't just saying a quick prayer. The word commit has a deep meaning. It doesn't mean simply asking for help, but rather completely handing our worries, aspirations, and desires over to Him. It's recognizing that even though we may have good plans, we need His divine direction. Now, trusting is just the first step. Then comes the act of trusting. And this is where many of us face the real challenge. Because trusting God doesn't always mean seeing immediate results or understanding everything that's going on. It's much more than that. It's being certain that God is at work, even when we can't see Him, when everything seems to be silent, or when things don't go the way we imagine. And let's be honest, that's when it's hardest to trust, isn't it? When things don't go according to our plans. But still, God asks us to keep trusting Him because His ways are perfect. The promise of this verse is clear. He will act. But here's something we need to understand. God doesn't always act in the way we expect. His actions are aligned with His will, which is good, pleasing, and perfect, even if it doesn't always match our desires. Sometimes we pray for God to resolve a situation in a specific way, but His answer is even better. We may not see it at the moment, but every action of God brings results that fill us with peace, bring us closer to His purpose, and allow us to grow spiritually. Because what God does is much deeper than simply solving an immediate problem. I remember a man I met at one of my crusades. He told me that he had prayed for years, asking God to give him success in his career, but instead, he lost his job. However, it was in that time of difficulty that he truly found God. He discovered that his identity was not in his profession, but in his relationship with Christ. Maybe today you are in a situation where you do not understand what God is doing. But I want to encourage you with this truth. God is at work. He sees what you cannot see. His plan is bigger than your understanding. So commit your path to Him. Trust in Him, and He will act. He works within us, shaping our character, strengthening our faith. And this is where patience comes in. Waiting on God's timing is one of the greatest challenges to our faith. We live in a world that demands instant answers, quick solutions. But God calls us to wait, not passively, but with active trust, knowing that His timing is perfect. And as we wait, He teaches us to trust not only in the outcome, but in the process itself. He molds us, prepares us, and when the right moment comes, His intervention not only resolves our concerns, but brings us closer to His purpose. This is an ongoing act of faith. Committing our way to the Lord is not a one-time decision. It's something we must choose daily. Every day presents new challenges, new decisions, and each day we have the opportunity to lay those concerns at God's feet. When we do, we experience something remarkable, the peace of God. That peace lifts the weight of stress, relieves us from the burden of trying to control everything, and allows us to rest, knowing that God is in control. I have seen this truth play out time and again in my own life and ministry. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed, unsure of what step to take next, and yet in those moments, God's peace sustained me. I remember the countless times I stood before a sea of people preaching the gospel, and I knew that the results were not in my hands, but in His. And every time He proved faithful. In our daily lives, this translates into real relief. You no longer have to bear the weight of difficult decisions alone. God is there, guiding you, opening doors you never imagined, solving problems you didn't even know existed, and bringing peace in the midst of life's storms. Can you imagine living each day with that certainty? God will act, and when He does, it is always for your good, even if it doesn't happen the way you expected. So today, if you feel overwhelmed, if you're unsure of what decision to make, if you're anxious about what lies ahead, I invite you to do something. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust Him, because I can promise you this, Though you may not see the path clearly now, God is already working on your behalf. Number 7, Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. I have spoken with countless people who struggle with letting go of control. We often feel as though if we loosen our grip even slightly, everything will fall apart. But Proverbs 3:5 gives us a completely different instruction. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. That is the challenge, to trust completely in God, not just when life is easy or when things are going well, but with our whole heart, without reservation. Now that may sound simple in theory, but letting go of control, surrendering our anxieties, is not easy, is it? There's a constant struggle within us to figure things out on our own, to make things happen our way. But here's the key. Trusting God means releasing. Truly releasing. It means handing over our worries, letting go of that urge to have everything under our control. Because let's be honest, how many times have we realized that no matter how hard we try, we can't control everything? God calls us to a full and unconditional trust. And when we surrender our hearts completely to Him, we release a burden we were never meant to carry. Human wisdom has its limits, even though we don't always want to admit it. We like to believe we have all the answers, that our experience and knowledge are enough. But this is where humility is needed. Human wisdom is finite. We see only a fraction of reality, while God sees the whole picture. I have learned this lesson in my own walk with Christ. There were moments in my ministry when I didn't understand why God was leading me in a certain direction. But looking back, I can see how He was orchestrating things far beyond my understanding. Sometimes we trust in our own reasoning more than in divine wisdom, and that is when we begin to stumble. God's wisdom is infinite. He knows the past, the present, and the future, while we see only a small part of the story. So why wouldn't we trust the one who sees it all and stop relying on our own limited understanding? What this verse tells us is that God desires to be part of every aspect of our lives, not just when we're in crisis, not just when things go wrong, but in every decision, every step. Acknowledging Him in all our ways means inviting Him into our daily choices, both big and small. It means giving Him the central place in our lives, not just when we need Him, but at all times. And when we do this, when we acknowledge Him and depend on Him in everything, God promises to make our paths straight. Now, that doesn't mean we won't face challenges or that life will be perfect. What it means is that even in the midst of trials, God will guide us, give us clarity, and sometimes even correct our course. It's a process of trusting that God knows what He is doing, even when we don't see it clearly. I have witnessed this truth in the lives of so many who came to Christ. Some found that God removed obstacles from their path. Others were given wisdom to overcome them. And still, others were led down an entirely different road, one better than they had planned for themselves. When we truly trust in God, a great burden is lifted from our shoulders. That pressure of having to figure everything out on our own disappears. And that is the invitation I leave you with today. Are you willing to trust God with all your heart? Are you willing to let go and allow Him to guide your steps? If you do, you will experience something incredible. The peace of God that surpasses all understanding. There was a time when I stood before thousands, looking into the faces of men and women, searching for hope, longing for answers. And I told them what I tell you now: God is in control. There is no greater peace than knowing that. I have seen this truth time and again in my own life. When we acknowledge God in our decisions, we align ourselves with His plan. And that brings a security that the world cannot offer. I remember preaching in Madison Square Garden, watching people wrestle with the idea of surrendering their lives to Christ. It is not easy to trust when uncertainty looms, but trusting God means that in those very moments, instead of clinging to our own limited solutions, we seek His guidance. It is a transformation in the way we make decisions. It is learning to recognize God in every aspect of life, from the smallest details to the greatest crossroads. And when we do that, when we trust His wisdom and direction, we begin to see how He makes our path straight, how He leads us exactly where we need to go. I have often said, the will of God will never take us where the grace of God cannot sustain us. And that is true. Divine wisdom will always surpass human understanding. Not because our understanding is useless, but because God sees beyond what we can see. His perspective is eternal. And when we align ourselves with His wisdom, we can be sure that our path will be the best possible one. In the end, it all comes down to this: acknowledging God in all our ways does not just transform our decisions, it transforms our entire lives. Number 8, Ephesians 1:11 tells us, in Him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of Him, who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of His will. Think about that for a moment. To be chosen by God, it is overwhelming. It was not random, nor was it an afterthought. God chose us as an act of love, deep personal love. How amazing is that? His choice was not arbitrary, but part of a carefully designed plan. And each of us has a specific purpose within that plan. I recall a young man who once wrote to me, struggling with his sense of purpose. Why did God put me here? He asked. The truth is, when we understand that we are chosen by God, it gives us identity and worth far beyond anything the world can offer. Predestination is a concept that leaves many with questions. What does it really mean to be predestined? It is nothing less than the sovereignty of God in action. In His infinite wisdom, He has a sovereign plan for our lives, and each of us fits within that plan. Yet He also grants us free will. Here is where the balance comes in. God has a perfect plan, but He does not force us to follow it. Instead, He invites us to walk with Him, to cooperate with His will. Our growth, our mission in life, all of it is connected to this divine calling. And what a comfort it is to know that God is in control. There is nothing that happens outside of His plan. Every event in the universe, every circumstance in our lives, God is orchestrating it all. I have met people in the darkest moments of their lives, after loss, after failure, after betrayal, who felt as if everything was spiraling out of control. But I have also seen those same people later, their faith stronger than before, because they realized God had never left them. Even in the hardest seasons, God remains sovereign. That assurance should fill our hearts with peace. No matter how chaotic things may seem, God has already written the story. Every detail of our lives has a purpose. No moment is wasted. No situation is meaningless. God has a plan for every experience we go through. We do not always see it in the moment, but when we look back, we realize how it all fits into a greater story. We are part of a divine narrative, and that changes the way we view even the most ordinary experiences. We are not just wandering aimlessly, we are walking in God's perfect plan. And what a precious thing the will of God is. Romans 12:2 tells us, the will of God is good, pleasing, and perfect. But sometimes trusting that will is difficult when we do not fully understand it. However, knowing that God's will is always for our good brings security, because He does not make mistakes. His will is what is best for us, even when we do not see it immediately. Our identity in Christ is grounded in knowing that we have been chosen by God. We are not just anyone. We are sons and daughters of the King, predestined to be part of His plan that changes everything. Living with this understanding gives us direction, a sense of mission. We are not here just to pass the time. We have a divine purpose to fulfill, and that gives our lives eternal significance. And when we grasp this truth, fear and anxiety fade. We no longer feel the need to control everything, to figure it all out on our own. We know that God is in control and His plan is perfect. We are freed from excessive worry, from the stress of trying to handle it all by ourselves. We can rest in the sovereignty of God, knowing that while we may not have all the answers, He does. And our salvation, it is woven into this plan. I have often said that God does not call us to a life of ease, but to a life of faith. Long ago, He predestined us not only to be saved, but to be transformed into the image of Christ. His plan is not merely about our salvation. It includes our spiritual growth, our maturity, and our preparation for eternity. And that, my friends, should give us an unshakable confidence. Our salvation is secured in God's eternal plan, and nothing can snatch us from His hand. So how should we live in light of this truth? We live with the awareness that we have been chosen by God. That means seeking His purpose in every decision, in every day. It means walking through life knowing that we are not alone in our struggles. God is working all things together for His glory and our good. And when doubts come, when hardships press in on us, we must remember God is in control. He has a plan, and we are part of that beautiful eternal design. I am reminded of Job 23:10. He knows the way that I take. When He has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. Estaum. Have you ever found yourself in a season of hardship questioning, why me? Why now? I have met countless people who have asked these very questions. Perhaps you have too. And in those moments, it is easy to feel abandoned, as though God is distant. But Job's words remind us of a profound truth. God knows our path. He sees every step. This is not an aimless trial. This is not something that has slipped through God's fingers. No, He knows exactly what you are going through, and He is present in every moment of it. The trials we face are not meaningless. They have a divine purpose. Many times in my life, I have seen God use the difficulties we endure to refine us, just as a goldsmith refines gold. Think about this. When a goldsmith places gold in the fire, he does not do it to destroy the gold, but to purify it. He removes the impurities so that the gold will shine more brightly. And that is exactly what God does with us. The hardships we endure are not meant to break us, but to strengthen us, to make us purer, more resilient, more like Christ. Every challenge we face, if we allow God to use it, is preparing us for something greater. The hardest thing for us to grasp is that these trials are a part of our transformation. We are not merely called to endure until the storm passes. No, these trials are shaping us. Every difficulty, every heartache, every unanswered question, it is all part of God's refining work in our lives. And though you may not see it now, there will come a day when you will look back and realize that through it all, God was molding you into the person He created you to be. Some of you may feel like you are walking through the fire right now. You are waiting, hoping for relief. And I know, my friends, that waiting is not easy. We want the trials to be over quickly. We want the suffering to end. But here is what I have learned. God does not leave us in the fire 1 second longer than necessary. He is like the master goldsmith who knows exactly how much heat to apply and for how long. If your trial seems to be lasting longer than you expected, trust that God knows what He is doing. The process is preparing you for something far greater than you can imagine. Do not mistake the fire for abandonment. God has not left you. On the contrary, He is watching over you, refining you, shaping you. I have preached to thousands who believed that hardship was a sign of God's absence. But let me tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. God is aware of every detail of your life. He has not turned His face away. Trials are not evidence of His absence. They are evidence of His work in you. And if you will trust Him, if you will surrender yourself to His hands, you will see in time that it all had a purpose. The analogy of the goldsmith is one of the most powerful in Scripture. Just as the goldsmith watches carefully as the fire purifies the gold, so too does God watch over you. He never leaves you alone in the refining process. So if today you feel burdened, weighed down by suffering, let me tell you this: you are not alone. God is with you. He is guiding your every step, even when you cannot see Him. And when you come through this, you will shine like gold, reflecting His glory. My friends, you are not adrift. You are not beyond His sight. Everything you are going through has a divine purpose. And when this season comes to an end, you will emerge refined, like gold tested in the fire, stronger, more valuable, and a clearer reflection of God's glory. This is the hope we hold on to in the midst of trials. I have seen this truth over and over again in my years of ministry. There have been times when I have prayed for something only to find that God's answer did not come in the way or the time I expected. But He was always at work, shaping, refining, strengthening. The Bible tells us in Ecclesiastes 3:1, to everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. This verse is a reminder that life does not happen by accident. God's hand is in all things, and His timing is perfect. How often do we grow impatient? We want our prayers answered now. We want our dreams to be fulfilled immediately. We want suffering to end quickly. And when it doesn't happen that way, we grow frustrated, questioning if something is wrong. I have met countless people who have struggled with this, and I have wrestled with it myself. But Ecclesiastes 3:1 speaks directly to our hearts. Everything has its time, and every purpose under heaven has its hour. Life moves in seasons. Just as we cannot rush the coming of summer or delay the arrival of winter, we cannot force things to happen before their appointed time. Some of you may be in a season of waiting. Others may be in a time of trial. Some are experiencing great joy, while others are facing sorrow. But hear this truth: every season has its purpose. Every moment has its reason. And yet, how we struggle against this. We want control. We want to shape our own timeline. We resist what is uncomfortable and try to manipulate circumstances to suit our desires. But my friends, that is where we create our own turmoil. The problem is not that God has forgotten us. The problem is that we are trying to rush ahead instead of trusting His perfect plan. Waiting on God is not idleness. It is faith in action. There have been moments in my life when I have had to wait, when the doors I wanted to walk through remained closed, when the answers I sought were slow in coming. But I learned something in those seasons. God was not inactive. He was preparing, molding, and leading in ways I could not yet see. There is a time for planting, and there is a time for harvest. There are moments when we move forward, and there are moments when we are called to be still. I have learned that God's control over time is absolute. His wisdom is infinite. And when the moment is right, neither too soon nor too late, He brings His plans to fulfillment. Think about how many burdens we would set aside if we simply trusted Him. How many mistakes do we make when we try to force things to happen? How many regrets do we carry because we acted too soon? But when we place our trust in God's timing, He provides exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. Perhaps today, you find yourself in a season of waiting. Perhaps you are walking through hardship or uncertainty. But remember this: Every season has a purpose, even the difficult ones. I remember a woman who once told me she had been praying for years for a breakthrough in her family. She had nearly given up, convinced that God was silent, but in His time, He moved in a way she never expected. The burden she carried for so long was lifted, and she saw that God had been working all along. You see, just as spring follows winter, trials do not last forever. Seasons of hardship give way to renewal, and even times of prosperity are fleeting. Life moves forward, and change is inevitable. The key is to embrace each season with faith, trusting that God is leading us through. Isaiah 55:8 reminds us of this powerful truth. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. How often do we think we have life figured out? How often do we believe we know best? But God sees what we cannot. His plans extend beyond what we could ever comprehend. And so, my friends, I encourage you today, trust Him, rest in His timing. Do not let anxiety consume you. Know that there is a plan, a purpose, and a divine hand guiding you. And when the time is right, God will reveal what He has been preparing all along. I have preached for decades that Isaiah 55:8 gives us an answer, though it may not always be the one we want. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. In other words, God's way of seeing things is completely different from ours. We may not understand what's happening, but His plan is infinitely better than anything we could imagine. Think about this. We see only a small piece of the puzzle, but God holds the entire picture in His hands. From our limited human perspective, we focus on what's right in front of us, the present moment, our emotions, our struggles. But God operates from eternity. He sees it all from a height we can't even comprehend. And let me tell you something, that's incredible. That means we can let go of our need for control, accepting that we won't always understand, but we can trust that God does. I remember a time early in my ministry when I thought I had everything figured out. I had plans, goals, strategies, but then God closed doors I never expected. At first I was frustrated, but looking back I see His wisdom. If those doors had stayed open, I wouldn't have been where He truly wanted me to be. That's the nature of God's guidance. Sometimes His ways seem confusing, even contrary to what we had planned. We think we're going one way, and suddenly life takes a turn in the opposite direction. In those moments we cry out, God, why? But here's the truth, His ways are higher than ours. What seems like an obstacle, what feels like failure, may be the very thing God is using to take you to the next step in your journey. Every hardship, every setback, every moment of uncertainty is shaping you, teaching you something you might never have learned otherwise. It's not always about understanding in the moment. It's about trusting that God has a greater purpose. Let me tell you something, my friends. Trusting God when nothing makes sense is one of the greatest challenges of faith. It's easy to trust Him when life is good, when everything is falling into place. But what about when the storm comes, when the answers don't come? That is when our faith is truly tested. Over the years, I have counseled many who felt lost, who couldn't see a way forward. And I always reminded them of this. God is working. You may not see it right away, but He is there. The best thing we can do is rest in the certainty that His mighty hand is guiding our future. Isaiah paints a powerful picture for us. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That is a humbling reminder of the vast difference between our limited understanding and the boundless wisdom of God. Rather than becoming frustrated by what we don't know, this truth should bring us comfort. God sees the whole story. He knows what we do not. And we can trust that even when we don't understand, His plan is perfect. Recognizing this truth leads us to humility. I've met so many people over the years who, like all of us, fall into the trap of thinking we can control every detail of our lives. But the reality is, our vision is limited. The sooner we acknowledge that, the sooner we can surrender to His divine plan. And let me tell you, there is freedom in that surrender. Practically speaking, this means learning to let go of our anxieties. When things don't go as we hoped, instead of being consumed by worry, we can remind ourselves that God is working for our good, even when we can't see it. The path may not look like what we planned, but we can trust that it is the best path. God's purpose will not be delayed. It will not be frustrated. His plan will unfold in His perfect timing. And one day, we will look back and see that it was all worth it. So when you find yourself in those moments of doubt, when you can't see what's ahead, remember this: God's ways are higher than yours. And even if you don't understand now, you can trust that He is leading you exactly where you need to be. Romans 11:33 says it beautifully. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable His judgments and His paths beyond tracing out. You see, we want answers. We want logical explanations that make sense to us. But when it comes to God's wisdom, there's something we must remember. It is beyond our understanding. That verse in Romans reminds us of a profound truth. God's wisdom stretches far beyond anything we could ever grasp. We see just a fraction of the story, just a fleeting moment in time, but He sees eternity. And that, my friends, is why we can trust Him completely. God sees everything. The past, present, and future are clear before Him. Throughout my ministry, I have spoken with many people who struggle to understand God's purpose in their lives. Sometimes we try to put the puzzle together with the few pieces we have, while God already has the whole picture. I remember a conversation with a man who had lost everything. He said to me, "Billy, I don't understand why God allows this." And I replied, "Son, God sees what you can't see." It's easy to get frustrated when we don't understand why certain things happen. But we must remember that God doesn't just see the individual parts, but the whole picture. The riches of God's knowledge encompass much more than we can imagine. He understands not only what we see, but the unseen, what's behind every situation, every decision, every long-term consequence. During one of my crusades, I met a woman who had prayed for her wayward son for years without seeing an answer. But God was quietly working. Years later, her son became a man of faith. When God acts, He does so not out of the moment, but with perfect knowledge, aligned with His divine purpose. What may seem inexplicable or meaningless to us, to God has deep meaning that fits perfectly into His eternal plan. But of course, this doesn't mean that His judgments are always easy to accept. I've been in hospitals with families grieving the loss of a loved one, asking, "Why, Billy? Why did God allow this?" We've all been through times when nothing seems to make sense. But the truth is that God's judgments are perfect, even when we don't understand them. It's like trying to see through fogged up glass. We don't see clearly, but God does. And that's where trust comes in. In the Bible we read, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding." Proverbs 3:5. That word, unsearchable, means impossible to trace. God's ways are so deep and complex that we can't fully track them. And that's a good thing. If we could understand everything, then God wouldn't be God, right? His greatness is beyond our imagination. While we are limited by our human vision, God sees everything with an eternal perspective. I've seen people go through hardships and years later tell me, "Now I understand what God was doing. He knows exactly where He's leading us and why." And this is where we need to practice spiritual humility. Accepting that we can't understand everything is an act of humility. C.S. Lewis once said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less." Recognizing that God is infinitely wiser than we are, and that we don't need to have all the answers, is liberating. Sometimes all we need to say is, "God, I don't understand this, but I trust you." Instead of living in frustration or anxiety, we can live in awe and reverence at His greatness. Every day is an opportunity to admire His wisdom and recognize that He knows what we don't. That all leads us to greater worship. When we recognize how big God is and how small our abilities are in comparison, our hearts fill with gratitude. A man at one of my crusades once came to me and said, "Before, I always tried to be in control, but when I let God direct my life, I found peace." So when things don't make sense, when you face a situation that seems impossible to understand, remember, God knows what He's doing. Trust Him in the midst of uncertainty. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to know that God is in control. And in that divine control, you can rest. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. When we give our worries to God, knowing that His wisdom goes beyond what we can see, we find incredible peace. So in times of doubt or confusion, remember this verse. God's judgments are unsearchable, His ways past finding out, but His wisdom is perfect. He sees beyond what you can see. And even if you don't understand every step of the way, you can trust that God has a perfect plan, guiding everything toward His purpose. Number 13, Isaiah 40:28. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God who created the ends of the earth. He does not grow weary or tired, and His understanding is unsearchable. I remember reading this verse for the first time in my youth and feeling a deep comfort. Have you ever felt completely exhausted, not knowing how to move forward? I'm sure we've all been there, but Isaiah reminds us of a powerful truth. God does not get tired. We, with our limitations, do. As humans, we reach the limits of our strength, but God is inexhaustible and always there with the power and energy we need. Now think about this. God is eternal. He has no beginning and no end. We are caught in time, living day by day, week by week, but God is beyond time. While we grow older and feel the days slipping away, God remains the same, always powerful, always full of life. I have seen believers cling to this truth in their final days with unwavering peace on their faces because they knew God was with them. And this has a profound implication for us. If God is eternal, it means He is never limited by time or wear and tear. He is always in control. And because He is eternal, we can trust that He will never abandon us. We can always trust God because His power never diminishes with time. I remember standing before thousands at one of my crusades, holding my Bible high and proclaiming that the same God who created the heavens and the earth is the one who holds our very lives in His hands. The Bible tells us that He is the creator of everything that exists, from the vast reaches of the universe to the smallest details of your life. That means His power is absolute over all creation. If He could form the stars with just a word, imagine how much more He can handle our concerns and struggles. Perhaps you feel that way today, but let me remind you, when we remember that the very God who spoke the world into existence is the one who sustains us, our perspective changes completely. And here's what amazes me most. God never grows weary or tired. I have seen many people, even the strongest and most faithful, struggle with their limitations. But God remains strong. He is always present. In those moments when we feel we cannot go on, God continues to be our unfailing source of strength. We can come to Him again and again, and He will never run out of power. And it's not just physical strength that He provides. He strengthens us emotionally and spiritually as well. In the midst of our weakness, He is our firm foundation. One of the most incredible things about God is His infinite wisdom. Over the years, I have met people from all walks of life, scientists, scholars, world leaders, who have admitted that there is so much we do not understand. So many questions go unanswered. But God knows all things. There is nothing beyond His understanding. We only see fragments, but He sees the entire picture. That should lead us to humility. We don't have to understand everything because God does. And when we trust in His wisdom, we can find peace even in the midst of uncertainty. I think of the countless times I have seen people in deep pain, wondering if God is really in control. In those moments, I remind them of this truth. He is the eternal God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He is not limited by our struggles or our doubts. His ways, though sometimes beyond our comprehension, are always perfect. This should bring us deep comfort because God does not leave us alone. Even in the darkest moments, He is there, working, guiding, sustaining us. In a world that is constantly changing, where so many feel out of control, the unchanging power and presence of God give us peace that cannot be shaken. He is everywhere, He sees everything, and there is no situation beyond His reach. That means that no matter what you are facing today, God is already there, working on your behalf. Nothing is outside of His control. And when we rest in that truth, we can be free from anxiety and trust fully in His plan. The book of Isaiah calls us to reflect on how we see God. Too often, we limit Him. We view Him through our own human perspective and forget His greatness. But when we meditate on these truths, we realize that God is far greater than we can imagine. And when we remember that, our spiritual strength is renewed. Instead of seeing our difficulties as insurmountable obstacles, we begin to see them as opportunities for God to demonstrate His power and wisdom in our lives. So when you feel exhausted, when things don't make sense, remember this: God is eternal. He never grows weary, and His wisdom is beyond measure. He is in control even when we don't understand. And in that truth, we can find peace and rest, knowing that God is in charge and that He never grows tired of holding us up. Now let's turn to the book of Psalms, chapter 145, verse 17. The Lord is righteous in all His ways and kind in all His works. I've often said that when we think of God, we may see Him as just or we may see Him as loving. But sometimes we forget that He is both at the same time in perfect harmony. Psalm 145, verse 17 reminds us of this powerful truth. The Lord is righteous in all His ways and kind in all His works. It is not that He is sometimes just and sometimes merciful. He is always both. And the amazing thing is that there is no contradiction in His nature. The justice of God and the goodness of God operate in perfect unity, shaping the way He relates to us and how He governs the universe. His justice is not just an abstract concept. It is the absolute standard of what is right. God does not conform to an external moral code. He is the moral code. So when we say that God is just, it means that everything He does is right, pure, and perfect. Every decision He makes, every judgment He renders is flawless. That can be hard to see in a world full of injustice. But even when things seem unfair, from our limited perspective, God is working out His perfect justice. We must never forget that God is faithful to His promises, and His justice ensures that He will fulfill everything He has said. But here's where His goodness comes into play. This is not just any kind of goodness. No, my friends, this is not merely human kindness, but an infinite and perfect goodness. Throughout my years of ministry, I have seen how God reveals His goodness in countless ways. We see it in creation, the beauty of a sunrise, the vastness of the heavens, the intricate details of life itself. We experience it in our daily blessings, in the air we breathe, the love we share, the very grace that sustains us. Everything God does is full of care, love, and compassion. But above all, the greatest manifestation of God's goodness is His grace. When I think back on my own life, I am reminded that grace is not something we earn. It is God giving us far more than we deserve, working for our good even when we cannot see or understand it. His grace was there when I first felt His call as a young man, uncertain and unworthy. His grace sustained me as I stood before crowds proclaiming the gospel. And His grace is here for you today, even in the moments when life seems senseless. Some of you may be facing chaos right now. You look around and see injustice, pain, and confusion. Perhaps you feel abandoned, wondering if God is still in control. Let me assure you, He is. He remains just and good, working in ways beyond our comprehension. Nothing escapes His notice. Every challenge, every heartache, every unanswered prayer is within His sovereign hands. But what do we do when we cannot make sense of our circumstances? When suffering knocks at our door and God's justice seems distant, how should we respond? This is where we must hold on to a fundamental truth. Our perspective is limited. We see only a fragment of the picture, while God sees the beginning, the middle, and the end. He knows the full story. I have often preached about the trials that refine us, and I have witnessed how suffering can shape us. Sometimes God allows these hardships to strengthen us, to purify us, but always with a heart full of goodness and compassion. He never delights in our pain, but He does use it to draw us closer to Him. Even in our darkest moments, we can trust that His justice is not indifferent to our suffering. He is present in every storm, guiding us, molding us, and preparing us for something greater than we can imagine. It is easy to recognize God's goodness on the bright days, when life is smooth and the sun is shining. But it is in the storm, when the waves crash and the winds howl, that His care becomes undeniable. I have walked through personal storms. I have faced moments when I too had to trust without seeing. And every time God proved faithful, He knows our weaknesses. He walks with us through every valley, and He will not forsake us. So how do we live in the light of God's justice and goodness? First, by recognizing that God is always faithful. No matter what we face, He does not change. His character is unshakable. That means we can trust that He will act with justice and goodness in every situation. Second, we must reflect His justice and goodness in our own lives, in our relationships, in our decisions, in the way we treat others. We are called to be just and compassionate, just as God is with us. There was a time when I met a man who had lived far from God. He had spent years running from the truth. But when he finally encountered God's grace, he became a new person. He learned to show the same mercy he had once received. That is what we are called to do. And if you ever find yourself doubting, if you wonder how God's goodness can coexist with a world full of injustice, remember this: God sees far beyond what we can see. His plan is greater, deeper, and wider than we can fathom. His justice and goodness will never fail. And when we understand this, our faith strengthens and we find peace even in the storm. As we conclude this journey through Scripture, one unshakable truth remains: God has a sovereign and perfect plan for each of us. No matter what happens, His purpose will prevail. Every experience, both the joys and the trials, has a place within His divine plan. This should fill us with confidence. Even when we do not understand the why or the how, we can rest in the knowledge that God is in control. My friend, as you face the challenges of life, entrust your path to the Lord. Trust that He is working for your good. His plans are filled with hope. And even when the tunnel seems dark, He is leading you toward the light. His love and goodness are present, even in the most difficult trials, reminding you that you are never alone. I want to invite you to reflect on what you have heard today. God has chosen you. He has called you for an eternal purpose, greater than anything you can imagine. Live with the confidence that He is in control. And if this message has spoken to your heart today, I encourage you to stay connected, to keep growing in your faith. Let us continue to seek God's truth together. May the Lord bless you, and remember always, His purpose will prevail. If you have listened to this message until the end, it means you are someone deeply committed to your spiritual growth and your walk with God. Your dedication to learning and applying God's word is evident. Keep seeking wisdom, strengthening your faith, and walking in His truth. My videos help people of all ages draw closer to God, rediscover forgotten teachings, and go deeper into His word. If you have come this far, I invite you to comment, "I am closer to God," so we know you are walking this journey of faith with us. May God bless you abundantly.